invocation song will be number 902. Number 902.
Good morning to everyone. It's good to see you today, and it's great to be in the house of the Lord. For the visitors that are here, we want you to feel especially welcome today. We hope you enjoy your time worshiping with us. We have a couple of texts that we will read as we get into today's study. Luke chapter 23, verse 13 through 25. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him, neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas," a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." Third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. Their voices prevailed, so Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. Let's also read the passage from John and a passage from Acts. Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And after he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him, but you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. In Acts chapter 3, verse 13. "The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of our fathers, glorified his servant Jesus, whom you delivered over and denied in the presence of Pilate when he had decided to release him. But you denied the holy and righteous one and asked for a murderer to be granted to you. And you killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses." About a year ago, Brother Matt worked through on a couple of Wednesday nights, maybe a Wednesday night and a Sunday night, the trial of Jesus. It was a very good study. And when he did that, I said to myself, there's more can be said about specifically Barabbas. And so I finally am getting to a time that we're going to be able to talk about Barabbas today. We're going to think about Barabbas, really four characters as we think about this trial. So just assume you just finished listening to Matt's two sermons, and this is going to be sort of like a part 3. We're going to think about Barabbas from the perspective of 4 points of view. We're going to think about Barabbas from the point of view of Jesus, what Jesus was going through. We're going to think about Barabbas from the point of view of Pilate, what Pilate was doing, who he was, what his circumstances were. We're going to think about Barabbas from the perspective of the chief priest and the elders, all those people that were encouraging the people to shout, "Crucify him." And then, of course, we're going to think about Barabbas from his perspective. I'll be using images today from the movie Passion of the Christ, and I thank you for your patience regarding that. This helps me. I don't know why, but it really helps me to put some kind of image with a story when I'm working through a story. And I've seen the movie Passion of Christ by Mel Gibson several times, and it's about as accurate as any movie I've seen on the death of Christ. So I find a lot of information, it seems like, when I watch that. And so I've used those images today to help us think through these different things. Let's think first about Jesus. The Jews had decided they wanted to put Jesus to death. So they brought 2 charges against Jesus. Now put yourself as if we were in a courtroom here in America. Think about it. There's going to be charges. There's going to be a judge. There are going to be lawyers adjudicating this. The difference is Jesus is not afforded all of the rights and the protections we have. For example, the right to not incriminate yourself. Jesus would not have had that. Right to counsel, like we have here in our country, Jesus would not have that. He had to defend himself. But other than those kinds of things, it's very much a court scene. And you have first the Jews. The Jews are going to come up with some charges, and then if they can come up with the right charges, they're going to go to the Roman officials and try to convince the Roman officials that these charges rise to the level of the death penalty. That's how this would have to work, because the Jews lived in a country that was being occupied. Let me take a moment to explain that, because that's really an important detail. Think about America for a moment. You know, we have the states, and then we have, you know, like here in Oklahoma and Texas and New York and the states, United States of America, United States. But then we also have territories like Guam or Puerto Rico, where you also have those same rights, but it's not a state. It's a little bit less than a state. But then we also have conquered territories. Until a couple of years ago, Afghanistan was like a conquered territory. And conquered territories, typically, like as it was with Japan and Germany and Afghanistan and other places, we still allow and have the local set up governments that rule and oversee that nation, but those governments reign under the directorship of the United States, you might say. The United States military will go in and establish outposts, and they sort of oversee the affairs of that country. So it's not a whole lot different for this situation here. Rome is a country, and it has states, it has provinces. Apostle Paul grew up in one of those, where he grew up. That was a place where he was considered a Roman citizen. There were also other regions that were territories, like Galilee was under Herod, so it was a territory. But then there were also conquered regions where the military had outposts and where local government still reigned. And that was very much like the area of Jerusalem. It was a conquered area. There was an outpost, military outpost there, headed up by Pilate. But they also allowed local governments to take care of the affairs of that area, like the Jews did. So with that situation, you can understand the Jews now, using their local government, the chief priests, the elders, and so on, are going to come up with these charges against Jesus. And if the Roman government agrees, then they can put Jesus to death. So their first charge is the charge of blasphemy. And this really unravels here in Luke 22, and we'll read that text again. If you are the Christ, tell us. And he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. Okay, so Jesus answered them really without giving a direct answer. He spoke of himself being the Son of Man and sitting at the right hand of God. Now, those were very loaded phrases. That's like dropping the mic when he says, I'm the Son of Man. He is calling to mind Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, which talks about the Messiah, the one coming from the Ancient of Days. So Jesus just did answer their question. Yes, I am the Christ. I'm the Son of Man that Daniel 7:13 talked about. And he said, I will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And he's citing back to Psalms 110, verse 1, where David says that the Lord said to my Lord, said at your right hand, this passage, very messianic passage. So Jesus, in a roundabout way, did answer their question. And they certainly understood what he meant when he said, yes, I am the Son of God. Yes, I will sit at the right hand of the Father. Because look at their reaction. Their reaction. So they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, you say that I am. In other words, yep, you said it, buddy. Then they said, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it for ourselves from his own lips. Now understand, under Jewish religious law, this would have been worthy of death. For a person to claim that they were God. You could go back to the Old Testament and see these kinds of laws about blasphemy, and indeed in the Old Covenant, such a man would be put to death. And so that's the grounds for which they're making this charge. Jesus, right there in their presence, claims to be the Son of Man, and he claims to be the one that will sit at the right hand of the Lord, making him king. He claims to be that. He claims to be God. And the Jews said, we have everything we need. He's guilty. Jesus made this claim throughout his ministry. You go to John in a text in John, they're having this same kind of conversation with him while he was alive. Are you greater than our father Abraham who died and the prophets who died? Who do you make yourself out to be? So they ask him, who are you? What are you claiming to be? Jesus responded, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you are yet not 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? And Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And he's hearkening back to wording from Exodus chapter 3, verse 14 through 15 that we'll be studying on the Wednesday nights to come. So now, if you wonder if that's confusing or if his answer was unclear, just look at what their response was. So they picked up stones to throw at him. So in one respect, the charge they're making has grounds. If a person is claiming to be God and thereby blaspheming God, that's worthy of death. And Jesus, without doubt, claimed to be the great I am. Now, we need to take a moment to remind ourselves of what that means. And we're going to get into the I am on Wednesday nights, but the Hebrew word for I am means something like this: the one that causes existence to be, the ever-existing one. And that's why the word or the phrase I am will be used both in past tense, present tense, and future tense. Jesus will say, I am the God of Abraham. That would be a past tense way of saying it. I am the God of the children of Israel there in Exodus. And as we study through Exodus, you'll see he'll say, I am the God of your future, your delivery. So I am God, the one that causes existence to be, the one that upon whom all existence is based, exists eternally in the past, in the present, and the future. It's really hard for us to get our hands around that, but that's who Jesus just said he was. Understand that. Jesus just told them, go back to Exodus, and that burning bush, that was me. That cloud on the mountain speaking to the people, that was me. The one that wrote the law on the tablets, that was me. Yeah, they would have grounds to kill him based on the old law if he was lying, if he was not telling the truth. I believe we have another one. John 10, Jesus makes a very similar claim. I and the Father are one. The Jews picked up stones again to stone him. They understood what he meant. There's no doubt that he is claiming to be not just a God, but the Jehovah God, the great I am. He said, I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these are you going to stone me? And the Jews answered him, it's not for your good work that we're going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you being a man make yourself God. That's the bottom line. That's the charge they're bringing against Jesus. And they think they're right. Problem is, they were not. A few days after his death, Jesus' dead body came out of the grave. He resurrected. That dead, mangled body came out of the grave. The Apostle Paul described that like this: he is declared to be the Son of God by the resurrection. Romans 1, verse about 8. A declaration was made when Jesus came out of the grave, and that declaration is this: Jesus was right and they were wrong. He is the great I am. He is the Son of God. He is the King of kings. He is the Lord of lords. He is everything he claimed to be. So while there might have been grounds for their accusation and their charge, they were wrong. Jesus was all those things. He was exactly what he claimed to be. Listen to how the Hebrew author describes it years later with the resurrection in rearview mirror, thinking and describing about who Jesus was. Long ago, at many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sin, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So this writer says that the great I am was in the person of Jesus Christ, that he died, he was resurrected, ascends back to heaven, and now he sits at the right hand of God. He is the great I am, the exact imprint of the glory of God, the radiance of his nature. I said that the other way around. He is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature. That's who Jesus was. Join me and stand in the crowd and look up at the mangled, beaten body of Jesus about to be taken out to the cross, and look at him. This is Jesus, the great I am. It goes against everything we might think, that this mangled, beaten, broken man is the creator of the universe, but he is. He claimed it, and his resurrection proved it. they just didn't agree with it. You, listening online, and you sitting here, are going to have to make your mind up. It's one or the other. Either Jesus was a crazy liar, and he deserved to be killed. They were right. And everything that happened to him was right. Or he is the King of Kings. You're going to have to make your mind up. You cannot be whatever on this subject. It's one or the other. It is absolutely a yes and no answer. You cannot be indifferent to this. And we'll talk about that as we go forward. Herein is the problem, though. The Roman authorities don't care about this subject. This is a religious matter of the Jews, and it just doesn't matter to them. They could go to Pilate with this piece of information that might seem a very good piece of information because Jesus more or less confesses to it. But Pilate won't care. It's a religious Jewish matter. It just won't matter. So they got to come up with a different charge. They got to have some other charge they can bring to Pilate that will carry the day. So they do. They come up with a different charge. They charge Jesus, the Jews do, with sedition. And what that means is that they're going to claim that Jesus was attempting to overthrow Roman rule. That Jesus in his work was attempting to take the place of Caesar. That Jesus was trying to do something that would kick the Romans out of Jerusalem. That this was sedition. That's what they're going to claim of Jesus. And in this text here in Luke 23, we can see that play out as they talk through it. This is what they're going to say to Pilate when they come to Pilate. So this is them, if you will, reading the charge, like in a courtroom. They're going to read the charge. Then the whole company of them arose and brought before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." Now you might say, well, wait a minute. Jesus just told Pilate that he was the king of the Jews. Wouldn't that be a problem? No, it would not. Remember how we explained this at the beginning. If we go conquer some nation as an act of war, which we have done before, we usually leave the government in place, including kings and monarchs. In Japan, when Japan was conquered, the emperor was left in place. Now, a lot of things were changed, but that's how invading countries do. Would not be a far-fetched reach for Pilate to look at this small state of Israel or Judah over which they have conquered. The Romans have military outposts there. Of course they might have their own king. And of course there might be disputes among them about, which one should rightfully be the king. I used to have a boss when I worked at Tinker. Some of you know Mina. Her father was the king of, I forgot the name of the little island that they were from, island in the South Pacific, that was an American territory. That's an American territory, but he was king, and there was disputes. There was a big family dispute over should it be him or should it be his cousin, and that was occupied her time quite a bit. As I dealt with my boss, it was something that came up quite a bit. Yeah, he was king over, wasn't Guam, well, I'll think of it this afternoon during lunch. A little southern island in the South Pacific. That's very ordinary to happen when a country invades and takes ownership of a land to leave the governments in place. So it's not a big deal for Pilate to say, oh, this guy claims to be the king of the Jews. And what's the issue? And so that's exactly how he looks at this. This, to Pilate, just Jews arguing about who the rightful king should be over them. As a vassal state or a small state that's owned by Rome. So that's how Pilate views this. And so he says, he interviews Jesus, says, I don't see the problem. I don't see sedition going on here. Now the Jews are insistent. They keep bringing the issue up. They insist. And as we read the text earlier, they finally convince Pilate, even though Pilate disagrees with them. But I want you to listen to what the Jews, the chief priests, said. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. So now they're going to be Caesar's friend, the Jews are. Oh, we're all about Caesar. That's who we're about. It's kind of funny almost. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat. He goes on to say, and said to the Jews, behold your king. Pilate even said, maybe this guy is your king. Behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Who's guilty of blasphemy now? Who's guilty of not recognizing what the Old Testament said about the king of Israel? The chief priests are the ones that really committed blasphemy that day. But that is the second charge they brought against Jesus, that he was claiming to overthrow the Caesar. And that was not that is not what Jesus had in mind. He was not going to bring armies into Jerusalem and throw the Romans out. That's not what his mission was. What's interesting, though, is Jesus is King of kings and Lord of lords, of new creation. The new creation that he is creating, that began with his resurrection, that continues through the church and the growth of the church. He is King of kings. Not the kind of kingdom that Caesar would. Why would Jesus want that kingdom? Jesus created a new kingdom. Listen to how Revelation describes it. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. And from his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. And he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress with the fury of the wrath of God, the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of kings and Lord of lords. He is King of kings and Lord of lords. At the pinnacle of the pyramid of hierarchy rests Almighty God, Jesus Christ, the great I am. And there are all kinds of authorities beneath him, but he is at the pinnacle of that hierarchy. He is King of kings and Lord of lords. Take a good look as you think about what Jesus went through. The battered body, the submission to what was happening, the willingness, even though he didn't have to give himself over. That's what defeating evil looks like. That's what defeating sin looks like. And you might say, no, that can't be what defeating evil looks like. What about the great battle at Thermopylae, when Leonidas went against Artaxerxes the Persian, and 300 men conquered that massive army, or at least stayed them to a great extent? What about that day? Wasn't evil defeated that day? No. Evil was not defeated that day. What about the Battle of Lyonnais in France, when Charles the Hammer stood against the Moors as they invaded into Europe, stopping the Moors from coming into Europe? It was a turning point in history. Was evil defeated that day? No. What about Yorktown, when George Washington stood against the British and finally expelled them from our country and won the Revolutionary War? Wasn't that a great day? Wasn't evil defeated that day? No. Because evil came back at Watertown and at Gettysburg and Okinawa and Normandy and 4 aircraft that flew over the United States. And it'll come back again. Evil is still here. None of those battles defeated evil. Evil was defeated when God said, turn me into sin and kill me. Turn me into evil and kill me. Because you see, that's exactly what happened at the cross. Jesus became sin and God killed him. Jesus became evil in the flesh and God killed him. We'll read some verses on that in a moment. So I wanted to go through that. These are the two charges. The charges were utterly incorrect. He did claim to be God, and he is King of kings, and in those respects, Pilate knew. Pilate knew. He did not deserve to die. And he said the scripture records several times for us. Well, that brings us then to let's think about this from Pilate's perspective. That's a very important perspective to think about. Pilate grew up in southern Italy, a kind of a desert type area. He was appointed prefect of Judea by Tiberius, and the reason he was appointed, that's because he had a good friend named Sejanus that recommended him to that position. And in the Roman government, the way these things would work is if you were going to work your way up to the political top, you would begin by being appointed a governor over some region like Palestine or like Judea. And then from there, you might work your way up to the ladder finally till maybe you would be a senator. Maybe you might be Caesar someday. So this is a great first step for a man like Pilate. He's going to start working his way up the ladder. So he's got a friend, Sejanus, that puts in a good word for him. He gets appointed as prefect or governor of Judea, this territory that Rome owns, that still has its own government, like we described a while ago. There is ancient inscription in Caesarea, Palestine, about Pilate and his reign there. So Pilate is pretty well documented in his history, not just the Bible record. It's fairly well documented about his reign there in Jerusalem. Sometime before Christ was put to death, a dispatch was sent from Rome, and this is documented also in some of the Roman history, towards Pilate. And the dispatch said something to the effect that, Pilate, you've been way too brutal there in Jerusalem. You got to back off a little bit. You've killed too many people. You've been too harsh. And I'm going to take a moment to defend Rome, and this sounds a little bit odd, but follow me through. Rome viewed itself as the savior of the world. They believed their laws and their form of government could go and change the world. And they viewed that right descended down from Caesar, that Caesar was the authority, and that right could go into the world and take these very dark places in the world and turn them into something more productive. And so the Roman government built roads everywhere. They established trade unions for people to work so that they could have what we might call equitable pay. They did all kinds of things that if you sort of strip away the names from it, you would say, some of those things aren't that bad. Even to this day, a lot of the things we do today are still defined by Roman decisions. I'll give you an example. The space shuttle that crashed, the Challenger, crashed because of the Romans. That's a root cause analysis for you guys that are engineers. Wes has heard this. He's familiar with this. The Romans decided how wide to make the Roman roads based on the width of their chariots. And so that's how wide they made the Roman roads. Well, time rocks on. That happens to be how wide railroads in America were made, because we never change anything, right? And because of the width of railroads, that determined how big of a component they could ship for the space shuttle, the rocket size and all that. If it had been just a little bit bigger, if the tunnels had been a little bit bigger, they could have done it different, but they didn't. And so you have these segmented rockets that they had to put together with O-rings, and so when the thing flew off and an O-ring spewed out and blew fuel out, that can be traced right back to the Romans. That's how much influence the Romans had on our world. It's all over. We just don't see it like maybe, if you're a student of history, maybe you could know that. Okay. Rome thought they were really helping the world. So imagine Caesar getting word that Pilate goes down there to Jerusalem and he's being really rough. Now Caesar is thinking, no, we got to turn these people into a meaningful part of our larger republic, maybe become a state someday. We need them to participate in this process, and we need them to not hate us. So he sends a dispatch down to Pilate and says, you need to back off. Don't be so brutal. Don't be killing so many people. That happened sometime before the death of Jesus. Okay. Now, so Pilate's down there. He's got this dispatch in hand. He's a real politician. You can see that especially from the narrative in Luke, which Luke is a writer that picks up those kinds of themes. I want you to think about the things that Pilate did. Pilate, first of all, heard what was going on. He was very wise to what was going on in the body politic. He knew exactly, so he was tuned in to what's going on. He wanted to know if Jesus was from Galilee. And what district is this man from? This man from which laws he comes under and how we adjudicate him. Pilate is going to look for any reason he can find to not make a decision. Politician. He's going to look for any way he can to come out being friends with both sides. Politician. That's what he's going to do. He's going to try to find some pose in the middle that'll make everybody happy. Was he from Galilee? We'll send him over to Herod because he's from Herod's jurisdiction. So he sent him over there. Well, Herod didn't do much with him. He dressed it. This is kind of funny. Herod dressed him up like a king and sent him back to Pilate, almost poking Pilate in the eye. Like, here's your king. Apparently, Herod wasn't that much of a politician. You know what happened as a result of that? Pilate and Herod became friends that day. That's what politicians do, right? In case you're troubled by this, let me say just a few words about politics. This is a no-no, but it's as true as it can be. The debate the other night, they were talking about a subject, and one of them said, no, we don't have the votes, we got to strike a consensus. We got to come up with an agreement, something everybody can agree to. The other person said, no. Leadership means you don't do that. So they had a debate about that subject. Well, here is the truth about politics. Politics is compromise. That's what it is. Whether you like it or not, the world is filled with people that have very dogmatic views. A politician, by definition, is a person who takes all these dogmatic views and comes up with a pragmatic solution. That's why we, by nature, none of us like it very much, because it is, at its most basic core, it is compromise. That's what politics is. It's the ability to find compromise between parties and come up with some sort of compromise solution. And if you watch through Pilate, that's exactly what he's doing. He's trying to find a compromise. What if I release this guy? What if I do this? Maybe I'll beat him and let him go. Maybe Herod will do something. He's trying to find anything he can do to not have to make a decision, to not have to come down on one side or the other. Pilate wants to be pragmatic in a subject that demands you be dogmatic. That's the truth. This is not a political question. It's not one where consensus and compromise can be found. Whether or not Jesus is the Son of God is a dogmatic question that everybody must embrace and answer. So Pilate goes, he becomes good friends with Herod, and then, he claims to the Jews, hey, Herod, your guy, didn't find anything wrong with him. Come on, can't we compromise? Can't we all just get along? And then he finally says, this man has done nothing deserving death. Maybe it'll make you happy if I just punish him and let him go. And they, as Brian covered for us in one of his studies on the cross, they just beat him. It's a surprise he didn't die from the beating. But that wasn't good enough. Pilate was a guy who tried to make no decision on the subject. He was a real politician. Finally, when the crowd wanted their way, he realized he couldn't do it. He made this unbelievable gesture. I'm going to just wash my hands. Nope, it's not my problem, not my fault. I used to work with somebody that would do that all the time. Nope, that just means it's not me, which almost always means it was him. Not me. Yep, it's you. That's what Pilate's going to do. Wash his hands in front of these people and say, it's not my fault, you go kill him. History tells us that Caesar had warned Pontius Pilate that he was too bloodthirsty, and that if he continued to indiscriminately kill people, he would be recalled to Rome and would lose his procuratorship as governor over Judea. Ultimately, Caesar made good on his warning and recalled Pontius Pilate to Rome. The death of Jesus, ensuing social upheaval, likely played a role in that decision. Eusebius, the 4th century church historian, wrote that because of the guilt he carried from this decision regarding Jesus, Pontius Pilate committed suicide. That's in Ecclesiastical History, Book 2, Chapter 7, Verse 1, written by Eusebius, church historian. There's a lot of history out there regarding Pilate that is questionable. This is pretty certain. No decision is a decision. Friend, you can't sit on the fence with Christ. You have to decide, because if you don't, you have made a decision. Just ask Pilate as he sat in his room waiting for Caligula's soldiers to come kill him, feeling the weight of the mistake he made regarding Jesus, grabbing the knife and taking his own life. Oh, he decided all right. And you are too every day. You're deciding, even if you think you're not. You see, that's what some people do with Jesus. I just don't want to think about it. I'm too busy right now. I got school, I got work, I got this, I got, can't we just all get along? No, regarding this subject, we cannot. Either Jesus is Lord or he's a liar. And any decision you make other than one of those two, you're fooling yourself, and actually you are making a decision. You're coming down on the side of those that are calling for his crucifixion. Just ask Pilate. I challenge you today, if you're watching online, I challenge you, make a decision. One way or the other, make a decision. Decide. And I submit to you the evidence is overwhelming that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He is the King of Kings. He is the Lord of Lords, and he died on a cross taking evil and sin debt with him. And he came forth from a grave victorious now. No decision is a decision. Well, let's think about the Sadducees, the chief priests and the elders. Let's think about them for a moment. We've got to take a moment to think about the setting. As we said, some years prior to Christ, Romans had conquered the area of Judea and had taken it over. They had military outposts there. They were allowing the local government to reign, but they did so at the pleasure of the Romans. The correct people to be in charge would have been the Levitical priesthood. However, the Levitical priesthood was not, I'm summarizing a bunch of history here, but they didn't view the Romans very favorably. So another group came along named the Sadducees. Now the Sadducees were what we might call secular Jews, had a very secular worldview. They struck a pose. They found a compromise with the Romans, and so the Romans made a deal with them, and so the Sadducees began to hold the office of chief priest, and they rotated that out. The Sadducees weren't unwise, though, so they allowed some Pharisees in the party. And they would allow different ones in as a part of the government that was reigning over Judea, but the Sadducees were by and large in control. Let me give you a taste of what that looked like. For example, Nicodemus. Nicodemus was a Pharisee. He was part of the reign, but he was in the minority. The Sadducees were the ones in charge. The Apostle Paul was schooled at the feet of Gamaliel, which was a Pharisee, but that was a minority. The Pharisees in the ruling group tended to be more sympathetic towards Jesus. Now you think, wait, I thought the Pharisees were the enemies. Well, you read through the book of Acts, the Pharisees in large numbers came to the gospel because they believed in the prophets and they read the Old Testament. The Sadducees, on the other hand, paint you a picture for who they were. They didn't believe in anything beyond this world. They didn't believe in spirits. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in what we would call the spiritual realm. They believed in the here and now. They believed that God had appointed Israel, the creator of the world, had appointed Israel to be a force for good in the world, and that was their job. And as long as they could keep things going, have the right elections, get people to do the right things from a secular point of view, and keep their reign going, that would be what they were meant to accomplish. They believed the law, the Torah, included that. So they had a very secular worldview. And I'm trying to describe that as fair as I can, but that's really a fair way to say it. We still have that same battle today. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had exactly that same battle 200 years ago. They sat in Thomas Jefferson's home and sat in James Madison's home and argued about, what's the right way to govern this? Should we look at the world as a temporary place with a spiritual hereafter, and all of those things? This is not a new battle. It's gone on for years, and it was very much a part of their battle. The Pharisees, they believed in resurrection. They believed in spirits. They believed in angels. They believed in a hereafter, in a heaven. The Sadducees did not. Okay, Sadducees are in charge. They're the ones that are ruling. And that'll help you understand a little bit about what they were trying to do. Acts 23 gives us a little of a snapshot of who they were. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So that gives you a synopsis of the two political parties, if you will, for the day. Okay. John 11 is a quote from a high priest, the high priest who was a Sadducee, a man who had a very secular worldview. And listen to what he says about Jesus. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. Do you not understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish?" Now, it so happens that what John says, he was prophesying in an odd kind of way. But Caiaphas, I am certain, gave this statement from a very world view perspective. Hey, we got to keep our country alive. And if putting one man to death that really doesn't deserve to be put to death is how that happens, then that's okay. You know, it's just casualty of war, you know, collateral damage. That's the kind of tone I see in what he's saying. You guys don't understand. If it keeps us in power, if it keeps our situation, this kind of little deal we got going with the Romans, if it keeps that all going, then hey, it's fine. You know, one man die so the rest of us can live. You know, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one kind of thing. And so that's their worldview. That's what they think. They're compromised already. Their leader is already compromised. These people hate Jesus because he represents everything against them. Think about what they say here. "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" Pilate consistently refers to Jesus as the King of the Jews. For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest had delivered him up. They were afraid they're going to lose their little thing they had going there. Hey, we got a little deal worked out here with the Romans, and it's going our way, and we like it, and we might lose that. Pilate was no dummy. He saw that. So he perceived that that's what was going on. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. They shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. When you can't get your way through intellectual discussion, what do? You shout down the other side. You make more noise than the other people. And that's what they did. They shouted all the more. Pilate is up there speaking reasoning words to them. Pilate seems to be quite sympathetic to Jesus. All of the accounts you read, he seems to want to let him go. And he keeps offering logic and rational thinking to them, and they don't want to hear it. They just shout him down. They just keep shouting and shouting louder and convincing other people to shout and shout and shout. You ever see that? Next time I go to Washington, D.C., come with me. That's all there is. People holding up signs, shouting. Nobody talking. Nobody reasoning things, listening to anybody. It's just shouting, more shouting and shouting and shouting and shouting. That happens when you have lost the battle. Silas, I talked to you about that the other day, I think. Young people, when a person resorts to shouting and name-calling, they do so because they've lost the intellectual battle. That's why. Don't ever forget that. When somebody comes at you and all they've got is name-calling and shouting, it's because they've lost the battle of ideals. Don't ever be that person. You be the person who will sit and talk to Hitler if you have to and try to reason. If reason is on your side, that's who you should be. Be the person, the voice of reason. Well, the Sadducees were not. They were the voice of shouting and name-calling. And they kept on till they finally convinced Pilate to give in. You see, what happens is when you hate something so much, that hate becomes greater than your ability to think. Paul explained this to Timothy when he said, "Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted, while evil people and impostors will go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived." That person that's shouting, they're shouting because they've convinced themselves they're right. They're not, but they've convinced themselves. So they just shout and shout and shout. It's all they got left. Just get worse and worse. I want you to think about something with these Sadducees. What is true about them? Did they love Barabbas or did they hate Jesus? You know, nothing else is recorded about Barabbas. He goes off into history as a forgotten man. He was not the hero of this day. The Sadducees could have cared less about Barabbas. They hated Jesus. They hated him. They hated what he stood for. They hated everything he taught. They hated him. When you go up against somebody that has lost reason, it's because they're coming from a position of hate. And know this, the enemies of the cross are enemies of the cross because they hate Jesus. They hate what he teaches. They hate what he stands for. Just go look at their signs. Listen to what they say. It's obvious. Don't be that person. Don't be that person. Don't be the person that becomes blinded by the light. Well, let's move on to Barabbas. Final character in our story, Barabbas. The Bible gives us a real big picture. You know, there is no extra biblical record of this man. Nothing about him. The only thing we know about old Barabbas is what we learn from the Bible, which is quite a bit, actually. The Bible tells us he is a notorious prisoner. That means he's well known. People knew who he was. Whatever he did, he drew a lot of attention to himself. He was among the rebels that were in prison, Mark tells us. He committed murder in the insurrection. It was an insurrection that was in Jerusalem. Luke 23 tells us that the murder was part of the insurrection. Luke tells us he was a robber. John tells us, and Acts adds that he was a murderer. Now, if you put all these together, it's pretty clear what was going on. There was an insurrection in Jerusalem. There was somebody who really was trying to commit sedition. Somebody who really was trying to throw the Romans out. And this man was a notorious leader of that group. He may have been the leader. He was well known, this Barabbas. Notorious means he was well known, famous. They knew him. So imagine this. You had all these Jewish people living in Jerusalem, and they go gather up swords and clubs and whatever they're going to gather up, and they're going to go charge the palace and kick Pilate out. That's what they're doing. And in the effort to do that, they murder people. Maybe some Roman soldiers they killed. Maybe some Jewish guards of the temple they killed. They murdered people in doing that, and Barabbas was one that committed murder. In the effort to do that, not only did they murder, but they were thieves. They were stealing stuff. He was a robber, we are told, and this is in Jerusalem. Well, the Romans apparently crushed this rebellion, and they've put them all in prison. So here you got the prison full of people, but the one that's notorious is Barabbas. That's who Barabbas is, and that's the picture that's painted here for us. So you can see how Barabbas might think that he is the friend of the people. He was going to kick the Romans out, and he was willing to do whatever it took to kick them out. He may think that they love him. Well, let's go on. Barabbas was probably not his name. A couple of the authors are very clear to say a notorious prisoner called Barabbas, and that's not the word named. There's a different word that he could have used if he were named Barabbas. It's believed by most who study these subjects that the term Barabbas was a title, not his name, and that may explain why there's no other record of him. We don't know his name, but we do know his title. It's believed that early in church history, or early on, the apostles even, gave him this title because of the significance of what had happened there. And the title is Bar, which means son, and Abba, which means father. You remember, for example, Jesus said, Simon Bar Jonah, Simon son of Jonah. You see that throughout the Bible. Bar is son. Well, Barnabas, son of consolation. Barnabas, son of consolation. Well, this man is Bar, son of the Father. How interesting it is that you have two sons of the Father here on Pilate's stage. And Pilate asked the people, which one do you want? Do you want this son of the Father, or do you want this Son of the Father? Can't you just see Barabbas? Yeah! He thinks he's loved. He's notorious. He tried to kick the Romans out. Yeah, yeah. And the people are shouting, kill the other guy. And Barabbas says, yes, I'm famous. Yes, it's all about me. You see that? Look carefully at the narrative. Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he perceived that it was out of envy the chief priest had delivered him up. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas. The crowd didn't love Barabbas. They had to be coaxed into it. Watch the chief priest as they go through the crowd saying, hey, cheer for Barabbas, cheer for Barabbas. And the crowd says, who? Cheer for Barabbas, cheer for Barabbas. They had to convince the crowd to cheer for this guy. He's not as well known and as famous as maybe he thought he was. So the chief priests are trying to stir up, and they finally get them stirred up, and now you've got people shouting, and they don't know why they're shouting. Does that look familiar? You have people yelling, and they don't know why they're yelling. They're just mad. They're just filled with hate. That's what they're doing. And Barabbas is up there going, yeah. Let me tell you something. If you're Barabbas, and you are, they're not your friend. They don't love you. They don't care about you. They just hate Jesus. That's the truth. That's the hard truth. I believe the reason that the apostles, as they recorded this, used a title for this man instead of giving us his name can be found in this text. Speaking of Jesus, he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Peter describes what happened to Jesus, and he says, Jesus, he himself bore our sins in his own body. Remember that's what we said victory over evil looks like. Defeating evil looks like Jesus becoming sin. Think about it from this perspective. You ever hear anybody say, how could a all-powerful, all-loving God allow evil in this world? That's a fair question. Well, evil is going to go on for a time, this battle between good and evil. But God, in the person of Jesus Christ at the cross, spread his hands out and said, blame me. Put all of that evil on me and then kill me. And that's exactly what happened. And Barabbas went free. You and I are Barabbas. Our evil, our sin was put into the flesh of Jesus Christ. He spread his hands and said, take Mike's sin, put it in me, and kill me. And that's exactly what happened. And like Barabbas, I go free. Evil is not my friend. It's not your friend. Jesus is your friend. There's good news. Jesus didn't stay dead. We can't leave this here. 3 days later, Jesus came out of the grave. Yes, evil was put into his flesh. Sin was put into his flesh, and he was killed, and therefore sin and evil's debt was paid. But 3 days later, he came forth from the grave victorious. Sin had been killed, and now new life is created. Christ come out of the grave, and in that being killed or dying and being put into the grave and coming out of the grave, he made a way for you and I to do the same. When you and I submit to baptism, we are saying, like Christ, let my sin be put to death. Put my sin to death. Kill it. And like the Spirit rose Christ from the grave, the Spirit, working of God, raises me from baptism. Not my work. It's the work of God. And in that action, I am created a new person, a part of Christ's new creation, over which he is King of kings and Lord of lords. And the battle will continue. There will be more Okinawas and more Thermopylae and more Waterloos, until finally the last enemy is defeated, death. And at our resurrection, the final blow will be made to evil. You and I, in this story, either you're Barabbas, you're going to allow Jesus to take your place, and you'll be one that walks new, walks free. You'll be like Pilate, who you think no decision is a decision, but it's not. You'll find yourself someday late in life sitting in a dark room regretting what you did. Or maybe you're like the chief priest and elders. You're so filled with anger against Christ, you don't know what you think. All you can do is just shout. With everything I can, I call on you to reconsider where you're at. Join me. Let Christ be the payment for your sin. Let him let you go free. If we can help you this morning, we invite you to take advantage of the invitation song that we will offer. You can come up and have a seat on the front. We will assist you in becoming a born-again Christian. If we can help you with the prayers of the church, we also invite you to come forward for that as well. If you will, come forward while we sing the song that's been selected.